Misha here, and this is the third part looking at Elon Musk's SpaceX. You know, we like to think of a lot of companies as being a group of people, and they absolutely are. All the engineering, the marketing, the press, the funding. So almost always it's a major team effort, and you cannot really point to one person. The thing is with SpaceX, while all that is true, it is still dominated, overseen, bore over by Elon Musk, for better or worse. And in part one, we looked at the various Falcon rockets, 1 through 9. We also looked at Falcon Heavy here. Part 2, we focused on the Dragon capsule, Dragon 1, Dragon 2, which has crew and cargo. And we also compared it to current day space capsules like Soyuz and Shenzhou, and of course the Boeing Starliner. Part 3, we're going to look to the future of Musk's ultimate ambition, because from the get-go in 2001 it was Mars. And there were thoughts about using Falcon Heavy to lift humans, crew, into orbit, to the moon, and maybe even to Mars. And to be fair, its first test flight in 2018 did send a Tesla with a space dummy on board and David Bowie blaring into what would eventually become a Mars-adjacent orbit around the sun. So a little bit relevance. And as I said in the first two videos, I really do enjoy making these. I've been planning this series for almost a year. Did the one on the Chinese space program, which I think was 4 parts, and it's actually going to be 5 parts soon. But please like, share, and subscribe, and comment. And also, if you know of anyone who might be interested in this style of video, hanging out, informal, I do this channel to relax. This is not ever meant to be professional. The Mishaco channel takes too much of my time already. But it would be nice to kind of get the view count up a little bit. It's not anything to do about the money. It's about appreciation and making it feel like my time's worth anything. Because, yeah, this channel has never been for monetary gain at all and never will be. But, yeah, if you could post it on whatever social media you enjoy, that'd be great, because I can't do that. I don't really have social media, which is weird for someone in my position to say, but you know the reasons. Anywho, this is kind of the present. Falcon Heavy has launched a few times. And before we get to the future, we need to go back to the past and give context, of course. Last time we looked at this, the little Apollo module from Corgi. It's about a 1/144 scale. This was a large capsule. It was much larger than Gemini, and while technically smaller than Soyuz, there's a lot of asterisks and caveats. This was America's workhorse spacecraft from the mid-60s to the mid-70s, with Apollo-Soyuz being its last flight. It only had about 6 cubic meters of space for the crew, but of course it could dock to the LEM, it could dock to space station like Skylab, and it could dock to a Soyuz via an adapter and that mission. But it was not in any way, shape, or form reusable. The giant Saturn V would launch. The capsule would be the only element to return with the safe crew. But this is the stand falling off, just a little peg gun. That was it. It could return 3 crew and basically no cargo from space, and it itself really couldn't hold much cargo outside of just supplies for the crew either. Now, again, things like the LEM and everything else, the Saturn V could lift more. It was quite a massive vehicle for the day and time, and a major undertaking. But right as the Apollo program was winding down, this program was winding up. The Space Shuttle. This is the OV-101 Enterprise, the test article, which technically never went to space. And this is from Hobbymaster. This is a 1/200 scale. Popping off the stand here if I can. And it's diecast. It's pretty neat. They do all the shuttles. They're all identical except for the markings. Yeah, this program was developed in the early 70s, and Enterprise here was shown to the public in 1976 and conducted test flights in 1977. And there were plans initially to refurbish it to go into orbit. Again, it had flown as a glider. Ultimately, we would get Columbia, Challenger, Atlantis, Endeavour, and my favorite one, Discovery. And they all were the same, but also a little bit different. And the idea was reusability of the four main elements. The two solid rocket boosters, they could be recovered and refurbished. The orbiter could be. The only one that really couldn't be was the massive fuel tank, but it was basically just a massive fuel tank. It was also meant to lift payload and a larger crew to orbit. Overall length, about 122 feet, 37, 38 meters. Wingspan of little under 79 feet. So it was a relatively large craft. It could have a crew of up to 8, although in practice 7 was the maximum, and the first test flights just had 2. And it had 3 habitable decks and a large cargo bay. If I can get this open for you here, there's a little tool they give you. Sorry, my alarm's going off anyway. Cooking dinner. They're made of metal, and that's actually very important to the craft. We have this very large cargo bay, at least for space travel, and NASA claimed that it could transport about 27,500 kilos to low Earth orbit. Now, part of that would be the crew and their supplies. The kind of max useful payload was a little under 25,000 kilos, but that was just to low Earth orbit. And in practice, it was usually less, of course. If you want to go to something like the International Space Station, which was kind of a factor in the third generation of flights of the shuttle, it could usually take about 16 to 20,000 to that orbit. Just kind of giving you the rundown. The crew cabin had technically 3 decks, although really only 2 were usable, with the front, the top being, flight. The mid deck is really where everything happened. And, you had about 70 cubic meters of pressurized, with about 65 of that being habitable. The lower deck was really just supplies. Now, you could attach a module in the cargo bay, like Space Lab, and that would extend really about doubling the usable space in there. Depending on how many racks and things, you're looking at 60 to 65 cubic meters of extra space for scientific payloads and whatnot. This kind of gives you an idea. It really, when the space shuttle had a module in, it was about this internal volume of like a module of the ISS today. So it was a big achievement. I mean, this vehicle was quite massive. If it was fully loaded down, it was about 240,000 pounds. Had a lot going on. Liquid engines in the back, boosters. And it flew 135 times. Missions. The first one was Columbia's test flight, April of 1981. And the last flight was July of 2011. So it flew over 30 years. The thing is, the space shuttle was controversial. Now, obviously, one reason were the 2 losses that were very public and tragic. 1986 Challenger, which would ground flights for 2 years, and then again, Columbia would be lost on re-entry because of the heat tiles and all that in 2003, which would again suspend operations for another but 2.5 years. So these are the kind of 3 generations. You have the early, so 81 to 85, and then you have the return to flight in the 90s, which was kind of peak shuttle time. And then you had the ISS construction missions, which were 2006 to 2011. That's pretty much what it did, which kind of fell in between. But the big controversy, besides the 14 lives lost, the cost of this guy and the cost of pound or kilo to orbit. We had roughly 22 flights in total in that first era, and they were almost 1.4 billion per flight, adjusted for inflation. And of course, part of that would be just recovering the cost of the shuttle program itself. That would also get it to be about over $50,000 per kilo, so $23,000 per pound to orbit during this era. And of course, Challenger happened. Once more or less routine flights would begin again around 1990 and run through 99. In this period, we had about 64, 65 flights, roughly half a dozen or more per year. Peak was like 8 per year. Towards the end of the decade, it tapered off quite a bit as things were changing, but this would reduce costs for different reasons, down to about $809 million per flight. And that would get our cost down commensurate to that. Say around $30,000 per kilo, $13,000 per pound to orbit. But then, of course, Columbia happened. The failure of the heat shield, the tile. And it would be a few years before we returned to orbit. But we had to, because the International Space Station had just started in 1998 with the first cruise coming 2000, 2001. So what are we going to do? Otherwise we just had an incomplete station floating around. So they would return to flight. But because of this, the cost would go up again for reasons, for the aging program and all that. Now, when Challenger was lost, they would commission another orbiter, a sixth orbiter. 5 would go to space, the Enterprise here would not. But when Columbia was lost, they would not do this, so the fleet is reduced too. Anyway, the cost goes up again to about $1.1 billion in the 21st century, meaning that the cost to orbit is again over $40,000 per kilo. Yeah, $18,500 or so per pound. Not as high as it was in the early days, but they know the shuttle, its days are numbered. There are 21 flights. Almost all of them are ISS assembly flights. Now, they were supposed to ground it at the end of 2010, but a couple of extra flights were added for 2011. I believe Atlantis was the final orbiter to go up. That was just to finish things. And there were plans to replace this with what was known as Constellation. However, by this point, government inefficiency and just contractors and bureaucracy, NASA had lost its kind of space cowboy edge and had lost kind of its mandate, its reason. Therefore, in 2009, the Obama administration canceled Constellation. And normally, I'm a big fan and a big proponent of spaceflight. But I understood because it looked like that was not going to go anywhere. And that's what we've tragically seen with a lot of NASA programs. I don't want this to be the case. I don't want to dog on NASA. But the truth is, they've time and time again set schedules, goals, and never even come close to meeting them. This is why the whole Artemis program, they're supposed to launch next year a manned flight into lunar orbit. We'll see if that happens with Artemis 2. I don't know. The shuttle, though, yeah, it was never near as cheap as it was supposed to be. And, the loss of life is tragic, but when you consider just how many flights it had and what it did, I think it was an important step, but it also stymied the USA. It got us stuck in low Earth orbit. We'd gone to the moon. And then that's the furthest we've been, at least on manned missions. But we'll keep this guy around on the table because we need to compare it to what SpaceX is up to. This video is primarily on Starship. And if this model, which is basically a 1/350, 1/400 scale, looks a little odd to you, you're not wrong, because it's actually of a much earlier concept, because this goes back really to before even the Falcon 1 had its first test flight. This is a pretty neat one, even though it's pretty small scale. It's Diecast. It's one of the Amazon ones, and it is very heavy metal too. It's almost entirely metal, which is pretty cool. But it's of a concept, really a pre-Starship, because this idea goes all the way back to 2004, 2005. SpaceX was about to launch the Falcon 1, but that was just basically to get light satellites into orbit, and that would evolve into Falcon 5, which was canceled, and Falcon 9, which they're still using today. That's their main medium to heavy lift vehicle. But they announced way back then, hey, we're going to do a dedicated heavy lift, and if there's a market, we'll do a super heavy lift too in the future. So we bring Falcon Heavy back, which is just 3 Falcon 9 Block 5s strapped together. This took longer to launch than I think they expected, just because it seemed like a simple task, but they learned a lot here, including ambitions. Here's the thing. This could get over 60,000 kilograms into low Earth orbit if you weren't going to expend any of the boosters. That would drop to 50,000 or less, depending on if you were trying to recover them, 2 or all 3 boosters. Still, though, we're looking at something more than the space shuttle. More importantly, the cost. If you wanted to recover everything, it was a little under $100 million per launch. But if you just wanted to expend the boosters, get the most maximum heavy lift, it was $150 million. Still, either way, far less than the shuttle. Plus, this had abilities the shuttle didn't. For example, it could deliver satellites payload into a geosynchronous geosat orbit, 25,000 kilos. And definitely unlike the shuttle, it could deliver a payload to Mars. Seemed to be around 16,000 kilos, give or take. And originally, it was considered to be a man-rated thing. They could put a capsule, maybe an enlarged Dragon 2 on top, go to the moon, what have you. And that wasn't really axed by NASA, but it seems like it was a joint decision between them and SpaceX. The Falcon Heavy wasn't dead, but its abilities were a little curtailed, which explains why it's only had fewer than a dozen launches to point. Although they all have been successful for what it is. It's a tool in their toolbox. It's cool. But this was the heavy lift vehicle that they promised. And they definitely did start dreaming about the super heavy because of Musk's Mars thing. Jumping off from technology that was planned at the time to be revealed on the Falcon 9. In late 2005, really SpaceX first talked about a super heavy and 100% reusable rocket system, which we have here. And at the time, it was known as the BFR, Big Fucking Rocket. Of course, they cleaned that up to say, oh, it meant Big Falcon Rocket. This name had been bounced around not just by Musk but other engineers, really since the genesis of SpaceX. And it was meant to be a 2-stage vehicle, which this does separate, with the upper stage getting the rest of the way into space, into orbit, or going interplanetary. And the first stage here, returning to Earth. It has the grid fins like the Falcon folded in. Originally they were kind of these elongated diamond shapes. The upper stage would launch off of this at about 75 kilometers from the surface of Earth. So this would get most of the lift there. And it would be powered by at least 27 new engines, which would become the Raptor engine. In fact, both craft would have Raptor engines, although there are 3 variants we'll talk about. So with other work going on, we don't really see a whole lot about this until about 2012, when Musk basically refers to this as the Mars Colonial Transporter. And then going from there, 2015, 2016, it becomes the Interplanetary Transport System. And the idea was basically it can do 100 tons to orbit and significant weight going to Mars. The idea is basically, okay, we're going to take over with NASA, first go to the moon, and then go to Mars. And of course, they also are saying this upper stage would not just have, crew on board. There would be several variations. It could be used to lift space stations, modules of them. It could be used to deploy multiple satellites, clusters of satellites. It could be used as a refueling tanker. So, they're looking at basically making it a modular thing. And the first stage would open up and use the fins on the bottom to land. And this, of course, would shoot up like a rocket and then kind of land like the shuttle, hence the tiling on the underside, using these fins to act kind of like a skydiver to land. And a few different landing methods were proposed and even tested out. Keep in mind, they were hoping to land this on the moon and Mars and take off again. So very different environments from Earth. This is really neat. And again, it's solid metal. This one's a little bit lighter up top. This top part's plastic, but that's okay because this being heavy on the bottom keeps it stable. The fins are metal too. And it looks neat. I think this might be my favorite kind of Starship look, but this is a concept that never really got anywhere, never was built. The more squared off end section of the spacecraft portion never happened. The grid fins as such like this never happened. The lower fins for a traditional rocket never happened. In fact, the whole landing on its tail never would happen. And as you might imagine, a launch vehicle capable of doing all that and being 100% reusable never happened, right? A lot of folks thought it wouldn't. And on top of that, SpaceX said we can launch these for $100 million each because of the reusability. So basically the same cost of Falcon Heavy. Yeah. It's had nearly a dozen flights now, at least iterative versions based on this early concept. So this is not a super large scale. It's about a 1/200, maybe 220 scale. That's just how big the assembly was. And it was actually going to be bigger. There were plans to make the first stage nearly 80 meters tall, to make the whole assembly 12 meters wide, and to have over 40 Raptor engines just in the first stage. Yeah, they did scale it back. By 2017, you hear Musk using the BFR name again. It just hangs around. And he announces that it'll be about 106 meters tall. It'll be made from carbon fiber composite type materials. And, well, it seems like it got scaled back a little bit, about 9 meters in thickness. That would actually stick around. But in 2018, they dropped the carbon construction. It was light, but it was hard to work, not as durable. And they went to good old-fashioned stainless steel and made some other changes to simplify and strengthen the system. And of course, it's on a whole new launch assembly. Finally, in 2019, we get the name for the program and the whole vessel as Starship, with the first stage being called the Super Heavy Booster, and the second stage being called the Starship spacecraft. And then, of course, you'll have the launch platform, the orbital launch mount, and you'll have the orbital launch tower over here, often nicknamed Mechazilla, not to mention the arms, which they're chopsticks. That's the official, unofficial name. That's kind of how this all goes. And it's all just crazy stuff. I mean, the tower alone is nearly 150 meters tall. And all of this has to be built new. And beginning in 2020, they do start assembling the launch platform down in Texas and working on the rocket itself. And there will be 3 blocks so far anyway. Well, we've had 2 actually be built and fly. Block 3 should be up anytime soon, and there's even plans for a Block 4, but that's getting more vague into the future because running changes happen. So let's talk about this. By the way, this was actually the second model I picked up, and I've had it about a year. And one reason I wanted to do this video for you fine folks. Not really sure how I'm going to do this, but we'll do our best here. Full stack here. This is an extremely large tower. The full stack here, fully loaded, ready to go, is estimated at about 5,300 tons. That's basically 11 million pounds. It's a little hard to estimate because the blocks can get increasingly heavier, more capable, and taller. For example, Block 1 wasn't much more than 120 meters tall as a unit, but Block 4 is planned to be over 140 meters tall. We'll see. Realistically, we're up to, say, Block 2. That's just a couple of meters more than 1, and the same with 3, so we'll have to see. Again, we have the mount here that it's on. It's actually clamped down, fuel hoses and stuff. Here we have a connection that works for the booster. It's partially there to stabilize it. It does move up and down on this. It also has lines and connectivity. The way they did these was kind of neat because there's like pads in here. But up here we have the very famous chopsticks designed to mount this, stack them on top of each other, supply things, and of course the idea is to be useful for landings as well. And you have the vehicle. So there were early concepts and prototypes just to test the things. For example, the new Raptor engine. You had the Grasshopper, the Starhopper that tested that out in 2019, just as a proof of concept on the Raptors. You basically had 3 versions of the engines. You had a fixed Raptor, meant for sea level, so atmosphere. That would be on the main booster. And it did not gimbal. You had an alternative version that would gimbal, and then you had a vacuum version on the upper stage combination. We'll get there. I'm glossing over a bunch of stuff here, I know, but this is pretty cool. This is mostly polymer. There are some like die-cast cores in here. Yeah, the whole thing would fuel up and get launched and take off as a unit. Just moving it out of the way of all this stuff. I could move it out of the way. The real arms would swing around, of course. Do all that. Set this over here in the side. So this would launch up together. They would settle on 33 Raptor engines for the main booster. So more than original, not as many as had been projected at one time. The entire body is 9 meters across. And one thing I think is kind of cool is it's made out of rings. The booster and the Starship are made out of roughly 6 foot tall rings that are metal, made in a factory, and then they're just welded together. And these rings are very thin, less than 4 millimeters, about half an inch thick. But of course, you know, there's a lot more that goes into that. But that allows for modularity. It also explains why heights of things can change pretty much on the fly. The original Falcon was assembled horizontally and then erected, but the whole Starship here was basically assembled vertically, transported vertically, stacked on the pad. It was kept vertical, and there were several reasons for this. So let's talk about the flight profile. So obviously, the initial mission would be with the booster, and it would burn for not quite 3 minutes, 2 minutes 30 seconds up to 2 minutes 50 seconds, depending on exactly the payload. From the beginning, SpaceX said this could lift 100 to 150 tons, but there are plans to do quite a bit more. And then once it gets to an altitude of between 70 and 80 kilometers, so still within the upper atmosphere, but just barely, the Kármán line's at 100. Some might argue that essentially the first stage would cut off and the second stage would ignite, using the top of the first stage as its own launch platform. Basically a hot launch, a hot ignition right off the booster. And then the Starship section itself would continue on into orbit up to roughly 320, 340 kilometers, achieving orbital velocity. And here are its engines. All 6 are Raptor, but 3 are the sea level style and 3 are the vacuum. And we'll get back to it in just a minute. The booster here, well, it's heading back down to be recovered. And at various stages in its descent, it'll be ballistic, but it will reignite various numbers of engines, never all of them again, but mostly the central ones, to control things. And it would try to come in engine first to use that as basically a heat shield. And a lot of the test flights, they would try to splash it down. But we do have these grid fins. As I said with the prototype, they would change these quite a bit. Notice they're sticking out. Unique to this, they're not hinged. They didn't fold in like on the Falcon. Now they can move to guide the vehicle, kind of like an arrow, a dart, you know, back here. So there is some pivot to them, but the mounts themselves don't. And they just made them strong. They made them out of stainless steel. So yeah, there's some flex and stuff on launch, but just part of it. Kind of neat. This is what they call the inner stage. It's a separate coupler. Now in later versions, it would be much more integrated to the whole assembly. It has changed a few times since this. But the hope is this can be controlled by GPS onboard computer and from the ground if necessary, so we can use the launch tower system for this. Using engines to slow things down, this is meant to be caught by the arms. I was trying to get it where you could see it on camera better. The truth is it would catch it more than halfway up the tower here. About 80, 90 feet up was kind of the catch point. meaning that it never actually hit the ground as such, using these grid fins to catch it. Yeah, about there on the model, maybe just a little higher. The idea was to catch. And then, of course, safely lower it down, and there you go. Support here. And from the get-go, rapid turnaround was the goal of all of this. Refurb, restore the booster. Pretty neat. Again, it's roughly a 1/200 scale, maybe slightly 1/220. When you're getting bootleg Chinese models, yeah, things aren't completely official. Plus, again, these are iterative. The blocks are changing. This is not a stable design yet, so this is not the earliest style. It does have some updates, but, well, we'll talk about the different blocks later on. For what it's worth, Starship 2 was meant to be captured by the chopsticks for its reusability. That's on Earth anyway. Landing legs, landing struts for the moon, for Mars, have been a factor as well. But no, you haven't fallen asleep and forgotten. We have not made it back to the moon, and we have not gone to Mars. But if we do, it's probably going to be because of SpaceX, not NASA. Again, hate saying that. Really grew up with NASA as a big hero. Some friends used to work there, but reality is reality. Also, sorry for the dishwasher going, but I needed to do dishes. That's how that works. So, let's take a closer look at Starship and talk about the variations, the blocks, and then I'll ramble off some of the missions that have been flown because, well, we've had 11 to date, with the 12th scheduled for early next year, and of those, it's about 50-50 success-failure, which normally would not be that great, except maybe in this instance it's not such a bad deal, just considering the ambition. Work on the Grasshopper, the Starhopper prototype, was in 2018. It would fly in 2019, and then in 2020 we would have the first kind of full-sized Starship trials by the end of that year into 2021 beginning. And since it is second stage, but it has its engines, it could go up. They had flights that would make it 3 miles, 4 miles, 6 miles, little hops. There were trials and failures. It took them a little bit to get the first successful landing using legs was in March of 21, but it landed so hard it crushed itself, and then it kind of exploded a little bit later, so oops. They would get a successful landing of the Starship later on. They tend to name these like SN4, SN5, going up there. SN15 is kind of considered the first truly successful one. And like I said, it's 9 meters wide. Internal volume was projected to be up to 1,000 cubic meters. And of course, that would be with people. And it was said that this could transport up to 100 people. A little bit tied in there because a lot of this is still fuel tankage. And here it is compared to the Shuttle, because these are both in scale. This is 1/200, this is 1/200 as well. You can kind of see the Shuttle still had more of a wing spread diameter, but this just has a lot more internal volume because a lot of the shuttles is lost to the cargo bay, which is not pressurized, so you just have up here. The idea for Starship is we could just configure the inside as we need. And because of the ring construction, they're actually quite fast to build, considering the space shuttle. It's a more simplified design. They also do, of course, use an updated version of the heat tile, the heat shield system from the shuttle, around 18,000 tiles, but they're actually held on with pins for the most part, not just the super complicated system on the shuttle. The shuttle, pretty much each tile is unique to its area. This does have some unique tiles, but a lot of them are designed to be as interchangeable with each other, as generalized as possible. You'll notice, a number of changes from the concept over here. Where did I set her? If I can reach it. Hands. Like I said, this is about half the scale, but the back end is very different. Just showing some of the changes that were made. So in 2022, they're getting ready for what's known as the Integrated Flight Test, IFT. That's, of course, when we get back to the full stack. Originally, they were hoping to lift 100 tons, but at this stage, Block 1, it's really rated for about 15. In fact, about 100,000 pounds is kind of what they're targeting at this point. Again, it's all iterative. So, April 20, 2023, IFT-1 set up and launched. It's booster number 8 with ship SN number 24. And it does successfully launch. And it makes it to an altitude just under 40 kilometers, 38, 39 kilometers. And for reasons, it explodes. It does not get to stage separation. So that's not good. But on the other hand, it did launch. I mean, if you look back at old Air Force and Navy videos and then early NASA's, there are a lot of rocket explosions, and Russia had their fair share too. So try again. And come November, Ship 25 and Booster 9 are mated together for IFT-2. And they launch on the 18th, so we're coming up on it pretty soon now. And it's successful. They make it up over 70 kilometers. And we have hot start, a hot launch of second stage. And it continues on, using its own Raptor engines. And it crosses the Kármán line, meaning it's the first to go into space. However, because of safety, it was set to destruct at about 149 kilometers up because it was having oscillations and issues and was about to tumble out of control. So they lost Ship 25, but it did achieve space. And these are still Block 1. Block 1 would actually be the first 6 IFT flights. I should also mention that the booster was also lost on re-entry, or at least return, on IFT-2. So, we're getting there. We get into 2024, March, IFT-3 goes, and it also achieves orbital velocity for the Starship portion, and it even does a mock-up satellite deployment, just a dummy cargo. So it's up there, and it does start to re-enter, and it makes it into the upper atmosphere, gets to about 70, 65 km altitude, and then it breaks up. Some failure on the heat shield system. So that kind of gets him set up for number 4. In the interim, Musk announces Block 3 and Block 2 improvements, iterative improvements on Block 1. So that summer, you'll get IFT-4, and it is intended to successfully return, get through the stresses of return, and does so. That gets us into Block 5 that October, and this is the first time they try catching the booster with the chopsticks, which they do. And then the IFT-6 sixth flight is just about a month later in November of 2024, and it has an interesting test. They try restarting a Raptor engine in orbit in space in a vacuum, and they do successfully pull this off. And at this point, they're just doing splashdowns in the Indian Ocean, although ambitions do go further. And that would be the last of the Block 1 flights at the end of 2024. So this year, 2025, has been all Block 2. So this year has been the year for Block 2. For the booster stage, we don't have a lot of external differences. They would kind of back off, and this would keep on through Block 3 even. Shielding for the Raptor engines in the back. The grid fins would be pretty well unchanged from 1 to 2. They would simplify, streamline the interstage, making it more efficient. But the Block 2 Starship is pretty different. They made it about 1 ring longer, taller, about 1.8 meters, nearly 6 feet. And that was to have kind of a rearrangement of fuel tankage towards the nose. They would also work with the front flaps, trying to address some of the re-entry issues they saw. And they would change the back area here a bit from 1 raceway to 2. And again, lots of other little dilly whoppers. And in fact, let's switch out our models. So 1/200 scale. Here we have one that is a 1/144 scale. Goes to show you a little more detail. Sides, and quite a bit heavier. The outside's still polymer, but it's metal. It's got a metal base for weight. It also has articulated flaps, which is pretty neat. Kind of how the grid fins can move, these can too. So keep in mind that Block 2 is just this year, so can't really blame model makers for not always able to keep up. And again, a lot of the changes are hard to tell on scale modeling. So the first flight of Block 2 would be IFT-7 at the beginning of this year, January, and it did not go well. The craft broke up, was lost. Yeah. For some perspective, just how large this is, here is the Dragon 2 capsule we looked at last time, which itself was, considerably larger than Apollo, but it's downright tiny compared to Starship here, and these are to scale. Let me be clear, on the IFT-7, the Starship was lost on ascent, but the booster was actually caught. It was a second successful attempt. They would try again a couple of months later with IFT-8. Again, the Starship would be lost due to an engine failure, but they would get their third successful booster catch at the pad attempt. And then IFT-9 was kind of cool. That May, I believe it was, or June or whatever. Anyway, summer of this year. They would do a reuse of a first stage booster for the first time. They would recycle one. And the two would successfully take off, but on this mission, both Starship and Super Heavy Booster would be lost due to, various technical reasons. Speaking about engines, this is a good example, being larger to tell you. You'll notice one is a more traditional bell shape. They're all Raptors, and one's more open. The more open one, like here and here, these are the vacuum-rated Raptors. The more bell-shaped or sea level. Just thought I'd point that out. So they need a win. August 26th of this year, we get IFT-10. And they do get their win. They successfully launch both. You have separation, and this Starship prototype, Block 2 still, does make it into orbit. The booster does splash down in the Gulf of Mexico. They weren't trying to get a capture attempt. They'd already done that a few times. And this would re-enter and splash down in the Indian Ocean. So yeah, much needed success for SpaceX. And they have one more Block 2 to fly. And this will be another reuse of a booster. It would be, actually, while I was out here at the cabin this time in October, on the 12th, 13th of this month, set up and ready to go and launched. It was pretty much the same profile. They would successfully separate. The booster would again splash down. And this time, the Starship itself would have about a 1 hour orbital flight, so it would make one complete orbit and then some around the Earth. And it would practice payload deployment, delivering cargo to space. Should mention the so-called PEZ dispenser. It's an attachment, a module that Starship can use to basically just deploy the Starlink and other mini-type satellites. And after being in orbit, it would successfully re-enter and splash down, ending the Block 2 program, the 5 total flights, well, a lot better. I guess it's better to have your first couple of flights failures and your last couple of successes than vice versa, right? But Block 2 was always a transition period because Block 3 was announced at the same time. As I mentioned earlier, heck, Block 4 is in the works. Next year, probably just within a couple of months of me recording this, IFT-12 is scheduled to launch. And that'll be the first Block 3. For the Block 3 Starship, really the updates are going to be orbital features like refueling capability, because that's going to be vitally important. There's still plans to use a version of Starship, the Starship Human Landing System, the SHLS, to go to the moon. It's a little different, especially the engine arrangement because of moon. And so being able to refuel it on orbit is vitally important. So Block 3 is supposed to feature those. It'll also feature improvements to the heat tile system, the heat shield system. And, they have lots of plans for what's going to be inside here. Block 3 is supposed to be up to 100,000 pounds, but they're still hoping to get to 100 tons. I should also mention that when Starship achieved orbit, it was the largest, heaviest single item ever launched into space successfully. I mean, obviously the ISS and other stations are bigger, but they were modular. Starship is not. Anyway, insides can be divided up. You can obviously get quite a bit of cargo in here, or fuel tankage for refueling. Or if you're going to do passengers, now 100, you might be able to do that as like a temporary thing going into orbit, where you're just on there a few hours, maybe a day. But going to Mars, which is months, if not even longer, and of course coming back, 100 is not going to be pleasant. But I've seen estimates of 20 to 25 is more of a practical crew for this size of ship, because even though it has a good amount of internal volume, a lot of it's going to be taken up by fuel and storage and, of course, bulkheads. There's speculation about different levels or decks, private cabins, meeting areas, of course, work areas, observation areas, and you'll need an airlock and other things for landing. So that space gets eat up pretty quick. I'll be very interested to see if there is a crew variant, what the internal layout is like. Bringing back the booster, there's one easy way to tell Block 3 from Block 2 is we no longer have 4 grid fins. They plan on having 2, 1, and then nothing, but they're going to be larger, heavier. And they also plan to, again, kind of reorient the engine shielding and arrangement back here, cleaning this area up even more. Of course, you still need the catch points for the latches on the tower. And again, Block 4 is going to, at least in theory, be even more capable of lifting more further. But we don't know. This is all speculation. That said, while obviously plans do change, SpaceX has been better at meeting their goals and objectives compared to really anyone else aside from China. And that's why I think they're important, because if we don't, China will. They've already done a lot in the last just 5 years. China has, from their space station to landing a rover on Mars, and they say they're going to land people on the moon before the end of the decade, and they very well might, which means we need to as well. And we're not going to do it with the Boeing Starliner. One thing, it's not really meant to. The same thing could be said for, Dragon over here. They're low Earth orbit. We have the Orion capsule, which has flown NASA's Orion, but only uncrewed. Will a crewed Orion flight happen? Will Gateway Station happen? I want it to. I think that's a much better use of taxpayer money than a lot of the crap we wasted on. But if you made me bet, I'd have to bet no. And I don't feel good about saying that, but NASA's track record of new technology, it ain't great. This concept one really is neat. I thought we'd bring it out one more time before ending the video. Very heavy. And even at 1/350, 1/400 scale, it's over a foot long. And of course, things change. Ambitions change. And when Elon Musk announced 25 years ago, or literally so, that he wanted to go to Mars, it seemed crazy because he didn't even know how to make a rocket. And it was crazy. But the fact he's come this far, well, after someone delivers enough times, you do have to kind of start wondering. Here we have the Falcon 9 Block 5 with Dragon, and we have the Starship stack, and these are more or less to scale with each other. You might argue this is slightly more than this, but close enough for government work. The Falcon 9 has become a very reliable workhorse, and seemingly the Dragon capsule as well. And if you had said we would be to this point with Dragon and Falcon 9 20 years ago, heck, maybe even 10 years ago, you should have and could have been very reasonably skeptical. I completely grant that. But it's happened. It's become a very routine thing with over 500 flights of the rocket for both government, private, commercial, even crew transfer payloads. Again, with Dragon back out, now that it's becoming a reliable vehicle. With that track record in mind, even though even today we're far from it, it's entirely possible that the Starship concept, at least on some level, could become a reality. If we're being very conservative, we could say, well, it'll become an orbital transfer vehicle, a heavy lift vehicle, maybe even taking space station modules up or transporting dozens of people to at least low Earth orbit. That's the very conservative thing. That seems likely. After all, this program's cost about $5 billion in total, so there's going to need to be a return on investment there. Medium kind of optimism would be going to the moon in some capacity. There are issues with that, absolutely, but there were issues with everything all the way with Apollo and everything. going to Mars, colonizing Mars. Well, how about we at least get people there first? I think colonizing Mars, that's a very pie in the sky dream. And I don't know if Starship is quite up to that. Going there, taking a small crew there, but getting enough people there to have a sustainable colony, which is what Musk wants, even one that could support Earth in the case of a natural disaster. I don't know. But what I do know is we need people that are forward thinkers and not just optimists, but people that can at least get the tools together, which of course includes money. You know, someone who's working, 40 hours a week isn't going to do this. They might have a good idea. They might make for a great person. Love it or hate it, you need a large government or a billionaire to have anything like this happen. And if you don't try, you'll definitely never succeed. So even if Starship is ultimately a failure, I think it was worthwhile because new technologies, new endeavors will come out of this, and at least it gives us something to challenge China with. I'm not even sure China will innovate a whole lot. They're very good at imitating and developing what's already been made. All new stuff, I don't know. But they seem geared towards it. I don't know. I see a lot of naysayers online. Of course, I see a lot of people that are just optimistic as hell, like this is going to happen. I guess I kind of fall in the middle. SpaceX has already exceeded my expectations. Musk, for all of his eccentricities, has proven himself to be more competent than long-standing government contractors. The Dragon has given us American launch capability again after being out of the game nearly a decade, and even before that, relying on the Space Shuttle, which was probably used about a decade longer than it should have been. Honestly, Columbia probably should have never happened. By 2000, we should have had its replacement, but we didn't. So I will be very interested to see how Block 3 performs next year, and there will be setbacks along the way. There has been throughout all of SpaceX history, so no surprise there. But I just wanted to do this little series for you. I've been kind of collecting these models over the last year and some change, but wanted to do it right. Really kind of cover things. Anyway, please do comment below. And again, as I said at the top of the video, if you could share this with anyone that might be interested, I'd be much obliged. With that, this is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.